I'm Richard Dugan, and this is Tell Me Your Story. New paradigms for a new world, where we're giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. And today's program, I think you're really going to enjoy. I know I am, because I've been looking forward to talking with this young man who has put together, and first of all, part of me wants to say an apology to you, author. He is an author. His name is Michael Hoffen, for calling you young man, because you're sort of an old soul because of some of the things that you have discovered and that you do even at the chronological early age that you have been doing this. Thank you for being with us here on the program.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
He has written a book called Be a Scribe, Working for a Better Life in Ancient Egypt. And as I was sharing with you off mic, or off air, if you will, that's kind of what this program is about, but not so much looking for a better life in ancient Egypt, but in this day and age. And it seems to me like we could learn something from the ancient Egyptians based upon the book that you've put together. First of all, I compliment you on the style. It's I guess you could call it a coffee table book, but it has some really fascinating information in it that I'm hoping our listeners will check out. We'll give the website out shortly. And it's broken. This particular book is broken down into 2 or 3 different sections that also deals with, that also deals with some of the occupations, as well as some of the aspects. But hieroglyphics, first of all, help us to understand, because in a matter of speaking, and again, I'm sure that there's a definition for the word and its etymology and so forth, but the alphabet and all of the other languages across the globe, are they not sort of a form of, if not a hieroglyphic, even hieroglyphics could be put under the category of a code? And that's what we learned how to decode it through our educational system. That is in the United States, English, the alphabet, in order to be able to form words, to form sentences, i.e. the books and so on and so forth, and even to communicate. Are hieroglyphics even close to that in terms of maybe not the spoken language, but certainly the written language? Have there been books that have been created using nothing but these symbols, these characters, they're almost pictures, like what you'd see in the caves of the cavemen and that kind of thing.
Yes. Actually, one of the fascinating things about hieroglyphs is that they're a lot more similar to our alphabet than you might think. So many people think, hieroglyphs are pictures. So if you have a hieroglyph of a bird and then a hieroglyph of a stick, then the sentence has something to do with birds and sticks. But actually, it's not like that. And many hieroglyphs simply represent sounds. So, for example, the vulture represents sort of like an ah sound, what you might pronounce as like an ah, or a snake represents an F, as an example. And then with these different sounds, you can create words and sentences much like you can in English. It's just that the actual letters, the letters, so to speak, are different. So, we use the Latin alphabet, which is descended from the Romans. And then, there's the Greek alphabet. The Russians have their own alphabet, the Cyrillic alphabet. And, the Chinese have their own alphabet, etc. So the Egyptian language is essentially just another alphabet. And of course, different words to represent different things. So if you wanted to, you could absolutely write a book in hieroglyphs, which is quite fascinating to think about. And actually, there was recently a translation done of Peter the Rabbit. Not recently. I think it was a decent number of years ago, but a translation of Peter the Rabbit into hieroglyphs, which is it's just quite interesting to see. But so absolutely, it's a lot. It's essentially its own alphabet. And one of the things that I find especially interesting is that our alphabet derives in some part from Egyptian hieroglyphs. And you can see this if you look at the letter A and you turn it 180 degrees, you turn it on its head, then it looks a bit like a bull's head. And essentially, it's a fascinating story, right? You can see the 2 horns and the head, and it's a fascinating story. But essentially, in the Sinai Peninsula, there were miners from Egypt and then also miners from Lebanon who, who are intermixing. And the miners from Lebanon, who later become the Phoenicians, were not, they didn't have their own written language at that time, but they saw the Egyptian hieroglyphs and they transfixed the Egyptian hieroglyphs, those pictures, to their own words. So, for example, the bull's head, which in their language was Alp, became became their letter A, and eventually the Greek alpha, and then our letter A. So it's and all the letters sort of derive that way. So our letter M is derived from the Egyptian letter that depicts water on water, a surface of water that's with ripples on it.
I have to tell you that what you're describing is fascinating to me, especially considering the attitude on the part of a number of people in this country in regards to, and I want to use this word very carefully because what I'm getting at is the fact that you, as a young man, you have the insight to share with other people who feel very strongly about nationalism and how people are feeling as though they are losing the quote unquote American culture, when in fact the American culture, including the alphabet and what you have just described, did not spring up out of a vacuum. That it is a I think the right word would be a conglomeration, if you will. Some would say melting pot, but I'll use conglomeration of almost every other civilization, every other culture, every other language, spoken or written, that's been on the planet since man has been here. And so for us to take the position that we are superior to any other country because we're so unique, we're not unique, because every other culture has its origins in all of the other cultures on the planet going back through history. Is that kind of what you have found as you have delved into ancient Egyptian culture and the hieroglyphics?
Well, I would say that one of the things I've found is how languages are very, they aren't. It's not as if, like you said, a language doesn't spring up out of a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
And all languages, for example, English has quite a degree of influence from the French language, and our alphabet comes from the Norman invasion. But I guess the I haven't. I'll admit that I'll say right now that I haven't thought too much about the implications of that on culture more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
And but I would say that the conclusion that you reach certainly makes sense. That the assets, like the facets, for example, like baseball, I think you have to consider where that might come from, and as opposed to just saying that it sprung out in isolation and from America. You know.
Yeah. Well, what I find so interesting is the book that you've put out, the way that it is presented. First of all, it's 8.5. I think it's 8.5 by 11, maybe a little larger. Not a
It's that
thick book. I mean, maybe it's a quarter of an inch at the most, but it's made up of rather thick paper and very, I'm going to say colorful, even though the imagery or the contrast and brightness of the colors is not like Warner Brothers cartoons, mind you, but it's beautiful in its presentation. How did you, was this all designed more by others who said, okay, here's the information you want to put forth. Well, here's what we want to put in the background behind it and so forth and lay it out. What part did you play in the layout of this book? Because honestly, I think that the way it's laid out makes a huge difference, I think, in the presentation, in the receptivity of folks, considering the fact that you've won a number of awards with this book.
Yes. So I, along with my co-authors, was actually responsible for doing the layout. And so a lot of those images that you see, most of them come from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which graciously allows people to use their images freely without, of course, with the with you have to credit them, but you can use it freely even for a commercial project like my book. Um, and so I had to learn how to use Photoshop and put those images in. And to actually create the layout of the book, I used this Adobe platform called InDesign, which essentially allowed me to interlay the various, the text boxes, the images, the actual translation, everything that goes in my book, all the little images of the hieroglyphs, because with each new word I tried to put in the actual hieroglyphic translation of that word. And with the InDesign, I was able to put that all together. And it took a lot of actually most of the actual translation of the text took around maybe 2 months, but putting the rest of the book was actually what took writing the rest of the book, and then laying it all out was what took most of the time.
Mm.
So yeah, so it took a lot of it took a lot of time. It was an endeavor that took a lot of time and effort, but I think it was well worth it because it makes it such an enjoyable thing to read.
One of the things that strikes me as we move forward here on the program, we're talking with Michael Hoffen, co-author of Be a Scribe, along with Dr. Christian Casey and Dr. Is it Jen Thumb?
Jen Thumb, that's
Jen
correct.
Thumb put this all together through Callaway Children's Classics. It was published back in April of this year, and certainly available on Amazon and so forth, and other outlets. Um, I First of all, I love playing in Photoshop. It's a lot of fun, and I've only scratched the surface. I mean, and even in the software that I use for sound editing, audio editing, I know that, and I'm using another program called Adobe Audition, that I've only scratched the surface, and I've been using it for well, since 1994, when I acquired the original program called Cool Edit 1.5.3 through AOL of all places, but when I started to gather fonts and I wanted to use different fonts in my documents and so forth, as I would go through, for example, in Photoshop looking for fonts, or I would type something on the screen, I say, okay, well, but I want to find something, I want to make it look differently. And I would come across certain fonts that were no longer the alphabet. They were pictures. They were just different little, I mean, and I'm sure you've seen these.
The dingbats, yes.
Yeah, okay, dingbats. All right, let's call them that. I didn't know there was actually, well, I'm not surprised. Of course, there's a name for those. Has have hieroglyphics and what you have been studying for years, uh, have they been placed in a format like that where if you were to spell out the big brown cow jumped over the fence or whatever this, and then you could search for Egyptian hieroglyphs, boom, and then it would put them out that way, or is that not something that's possible because it's literally the combination and the order in which the hieroglyphs are placed that determines what's being spoken or what's trying to be transmitted?
So actually, there actually is a hieroglyphic keyboard that allows you to type in hieroglyphs. So essentially, it allows
Oh,
you to a lot of the hieroglyphic symbols. I mentioned the F and the A, but a lot of them are actually what you might call biliterals or triliterals or multiliterals because they represent a combination of sounds. Like for example, uh, men is represented kind of by this Lego brick shape. And rather than just an M and an N separately, it's those two together. And so when you use the keyboard, you sort of type an M and an N, and then it gives you when you type an N and M by itself, it gives you an owl, and then you type an N, and it gives you the MN symbol. And then when you press space, it goes to a different word. So it's a little bit more complicated because, of course, you have the combination of sounds,
mm-hmm.
and not all. And there are thousands of hieroglyphic characters, and not all of them can be represented on one single keyboard by like not all of them can be represented by one by pressing one button. But there is a hieroglyphic keyboard, but it's not actually what we use in the book. For the book, we use this program called JSesh, which, the hieroglyphic keyboard, you can just type them all out in one line. What's unique about hieroglyphs is that the Egyptians stacked them on top of each other to make it more aesthetically pleasing. So like two long signs, they would stack them on top of each other so that they would fill out any empty space. And you have to use a program called JSesh to type them out that way, and to arrange them in that format. And then it becomes less text and more an image, and you have to download it as an image file. But yeah, no, it's amazing how even though hieroglyphs, such a small field, there are not that many Egyptologists out in the world. People have created their own keyboard and their own typing system.
I want to get into the book and some of the elements that you've put in there, but I want to ask you about um, what your perception has been being a scribe yourself. What is maybe the one thing, or maybe there's more than one thing, that you have found that the general public, intrigued by ancient Egypt and the hieroglyphs and so forth, just curious, some of maybe one or two of the misconceptions that that we have, maybe myths is a better word to use, that we have about Egypt and life back in, I guess, what would we call them, the pyramid days, of ancient Egypt 4,000 years ago, that we really have never really understood the Egyptian culture, and that if we were to understand ancient Egypt, we might better understand modern Egypt.
Sure. So, I mean, I think there are many different things I can mention about things that people have misunderstood about Egypt, even things that I used to once think before I really began learning about 4 years ago. But like, for example, one people often think that Egypt is just this big desert, and it's pretty much all desert. And you have the Nile, but then you walk just for a few minutes outside the Nile, and there's the desert again. But really, most of Egypt, or at least the places in Egypt that are the most inhabited, is the Nile Valley. And the Nile Valley is actually quite green. You've got lots of plants growing along there, and it's quite wide as well. It extends for miles, and it's probably some of the richest agricultural soil in many places in the world. I think that's definitely one big misconception. And also, at that now, the areas outside the Nile Valley are mostly desert. But at the time of ancient Egypt, there's evidence that it actually must have been more like a plain, like a kind of like um, a plain where large animals might have grazed, sort of like areas that are now further south in Africa. There used to be lions in Egypt, and so it was less of a desert and more of sort of a grassland, with few sparse trees. So I think that's one misconception. I already mentioned, of course, the alphabet and the fact that hieroglyphs isn't picture writing. It's not. They aren't. It's not. They're. It sounds right. It's phonograms, not symbols that represent sound, not symbols that represent images. Sorry.
Right. In other words, our letter A is a symbol, just like, I'll just use this as an example. Their letter A, whatever that symbol looks like, it's just a symbol of
That's correct. Yeah.
the sound that is to be made, as you've alluded. What is so wonderful about this is you created this book with these two other folks, Christian and Jen, in reference to, first of all, you actually have a section in here at the front end that helps people to get ready to learn some ancient Egyptian,
Yes.
to help them to better understand, because you then created in the book, through these different fonts, colors of text, and so forth, the actual hieroglyph. Then you translate it into the phonetic, and then you translate it into English, and you give the definition and those kinds of things. I think that that's a wonderful opportunity for people to maybe not learn how to speak Egyptian, or and that's the other question I have for you. Are we talking about the Egyptian language here? Is that is that what we're referring to? And is it the same back 4,000 years ago, or has it really changed that much in 4,000 years?
So the thing about the Egyptian language, the spoken language that is that we don't actually know what Egyptian sounded like. Of course, we have some general idea of what the signs in the Egyptian language must have corresponded to, like what the sound that we call a P, for example, which is just a square. We know that that's probably sounded something like a P, but we don't really know if that's the exact sound or if it sounded maybe some a little bit different, and whether those sounds changed over time. So when in the book we have that transliteration which says say, and then a word that, and then say like a set of sounds that instructs you to say the Egyptian word. It's essentially somewhat of a guess. That's what we think it might have sounded like, but of course there's no evidence, and it probably sounded nothing like that guess, which is, I mean, it's quite unfortunate. But right now, Egyptologists are in the process of using Coptic, which is a language spoken by the Coptic Christians in Egypt, to work their way backwards, because Coptic is the only surviving language that descends from Egyptian, and of course it's very different.
Mhm.
English today sounds very different than Old English might have sounded 1,000 years ago. But they're trying to use the sounds of Coptic and use the words that are similar to maybe to reconstruct what Egyptian might have sounded like. But it's quite a complicated process, as you can imagine. Um,
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to jump back. We'll get back into the book here because you also, I mean, again, you have some incredible stuff in here, and it's a wonderful book just to flip through and look at the pictures. you know uh, but also we can learn something as well along the way. We also have a timeline in here that we'll talk about as well. By the way, folks, we're talking with Michael Hoffen. He's the co-author of a wonderful book you're going to want to get a copy of, Be a Scribe. We hope that you will check it out, because I think it's something that will, I think it'd be a great addition to your library, but also a great addition to we call it a smorgasbord table, Michael, where every time we have a program where we talk with someone such as yourself, we're putting something new on that table for people to come and partake of. And we hope that they will. And then they'll come back and check out other things as well. Again, this is Working for a Better Life in Ancient Egypt, along with his co-authors, as I have mentioned before, who are Dr. Christian Casey and Dr. Jen Thumb. And we hope that you'll get a copy of it as you go to the website. And what is the best, aside from, say, Amazon.com and put in Be a Scribe, where else can we go to find out more about the work that you have been doing for some time and are doing currently?
so the website, you can go to our website, which is beascribe.com.
So
So that
easy, so
has
easy.
all the links to Amazon, as well as Barnes and Noble, and also any other information about the book that you could ever want to have.
Wonderful, wonderful. We'll also mention too that, for example, Dr. Christian Casey is an Egyptologist who specializes in the study of ancient Egyptian languages, and he obtained his PhD in Egyptology from, I have to say that slowly or I'll mess it up, from Brown University in 2020, and now works as a researcher at, is it Freebie? Freddie University?
Fry University, Tom.
Fry, okay, Fry University. That tells you what I know about German. Fry University in Berlin. He is also especially interested in sharing the exciting world of ancient Egypt with young people and other interested members of the public. And Dr. Jen Thumb is also an Egyptologist educator and a curator at the Harvard Art Museum. She studied Egyptology and archaeology at the University of Oxford and Brown University, and her work celebrates the learning potential of ancient material cultures, especially across disciplines, and she teaches at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She writes and leads workshops about learning with art and artifacts and so forth. I want to ask you, in terms of your personal philosophy as you have been growing, and you're still in your teen years, right?
Yes, I'm 17.
17. Um, I'm curious as to how the study as a scribe of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, which obviously leads you in all of these different subjects that are pointed out in this wonderful book here, how that has framed your personal philosophy of life and living.
Could I just ask what you might define as like a personal philosophy of life?
Well, other people might use the word religion as opposed to philosophy. How were you raised? I mean, I was born and raised Roman Catholic, but I consider myself today to be a metaphysician because I'm curious about all of the different philosophies across the planet down through the ages.
I mean, well, I would say, I mean, I was born and raised, and I still am Jewish, but I wouldn't really say that you know, learning about Egypt has affected necessarily that part of that aspect of myself. But I think learning about the past and generally my interest in the past has made me, I think it's made me realize, a lot of people say when I tell them I'm learning hieroglyphs, they say, what's the point of that? Like, why? What's the reason for doing that? And I guess learning hieroglyphs has made me realize, what really is the reason for that. Because I think first of all, it's just astonishing to see the similarities between the past, between ancient Egyptian society and our own, despite the myriad technological differences. But also, I think what really fascinates me are the differences between ancient Egyptian society and our own. And I think a good way to, like to get a sense of what that really means is if you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or really any Egyptian temple, and you go inside the Temple of Dendur, or any Egyptian temple, like I said,
Mhm.
and you see the Egyptian writing on the walls, and you just have to imagine, right? Nowadays, in the modern times, it's very easy to put our thoughts into writing, to immortalize them, right? You could just type on a keyboard or scribble a note on a piece of paper. But back then, of course, there's papyrus, but that was expensive, and so you had to, to carve these symbols deep into the stone walls. That takes a lot of effort, and so it's interesting to consider, what did they write down? What did they think that was so important that needed to be etched into stone and immortalized forever? And versus like what would you write down today? What would I write down? What would you as the audience? What would you carve into stone, and preserve in a temple? And I think it's fascinating to see, the difference, to see the differences in the core driving values, you could say, of their society, which, most of in the Temple of Dendur, it's a religious temple, dedicated, actually, it has a fascinating history, dedicated to Augustus, the Roman emperor, at the time when Rome was beginning to consolidate its rule over Egypt. Um, but it's interesting to see, at that time, the specific Egyptian religion was a major, motivating factor of their culture and their society. And nowadays, I think the answers would be completely different. Maybe some people would record, the names of all their family, or they would, or they might record, um, a specific piece of knowledge that they thought found was particularly interesting, or
Mhm.
a message or a motto for life, that they want to preserve for future generations. So I just think it's fascinating to compare and contrast our societies and the Egyptian society and past societies.
What about the similarities between ancient Egypt and maybe modern day Egypt? We could go there, but I'm thinking in terms of oh, and by the way, one of the other differences, or one of the other elements I think that a lot of people are unaware of, or shall I say they just, well, maybe it is unaware. Egypt I think a lot of people think that Egypt is part of the Middle East, but it's not. It's part of Africa.
Yes.
And
Well,
I don't know why that makes a difference, but I don't know. It just seems like geography, apparently we're losing our geographical awareness because we don't know where certain countries are on certain continents.
yes. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about the similarities then. I'll talk first about the actual story that I
Okay.
translated for the book. So the story follows a father and a son, Kheti and his son Pepi, and they're traveling down the Nile, up the Nile actually, to the capital of Egypt, where Kheti is a minor and he wants to enroll his son in scribal school so that his son can be a scribe and have a chance at a better life. And that's where the title comes from, be a scribe working for a better life in ancient Egypt. And along the way, he gives his son examples of all the various jobs that his son could have if he doesn't get to become a scribe. So he could be a carpenter, or woodworker. I guess in those times he could be a fisherman, etc. And and then he explains to his son why all those jobs are the worst jobs in the whole land of Egypt and why he should never want them. And he uses a lot of exaggeration. And then he explains to his son why he thinks the scribe is the best job in the whole land of Egypt, and why his son should study really hard at scribal school and not slack off
Mhm.
in order to become a scribe. And then at the end of the text, the father gives his son advice for how to navigate life in the capital, because the son is coming from this small town in the Nile Delta, and then he's going to the capital of Egypt. It's quite a culture difference. So he gives his son advice and tells him things like you should respect your father and your mother, or you shouldn't eat excessively, or you should walk after people who are more important than you. Um, Rather than because they're more important. You should show respect. You shouldn't stand up from the table when someone else who's more important than you is still sitting down.
Mm.
And I think it's those pieces of advice that demonstrate a lot of the connection between the ancient Egyptian society and our own. Even all these thousands of years later, we're still, people are still giving their kids the same advice as this Egyptian father gave his own child, and it's just when I first translated that part, I was really surprised. How is it that the Egyptians are giving the same advice to the Egyptians are using the same advice as we use, but in fact it makes sense. It shows that our societies and our cultures have changed a lot, but the human condition hasn't really changed that much. And the same vices that people were struggling with back then, overeating, etc., are still are people are still struggling with today.
Fascinating. It really is. Um, what are some of the things that you personally have taken away from your study of hieroglyphs and your study of ancient Egypt in terms of maybe rethinking ways in which you might think, things that you might do, maybe even your own personal are there vocabulary words that you have added to your maybe thousands upon thousands of words that are in your vocabulary that you didn't use before you started doing this study, and now all of a sudden that's part of it's for me, for example, in the book Stranger in a Strange Land, there's the word grok or to grok, which I define as to assimilate into every cell of your being. That, for example, if I was to do that with Be a Scribe, and I would scrutinize the book from cover to cover and go over every single word and just absorb it like a sponge. That would be one word for me that I love to use. Are there vocabulary words that you have added that you weren't using before?
Well, I mean, I guess one word that I particularly liked is the word gumptious, and of course, it just comes from the Egyptian a translation of it's the nearest translation of an Egyptian word, but it basically gumptious essentially means, hardworking, and you sort of
Hmm.
um you want to get down to business. It's quite a fun word, gumptious.
Gumptious.
But I also like it because in that section, this is the wisdom part. Khedi is telling his son that you should be gumptious. And in an earlier part, he tells his son, you should hurry your legs when you're going, and you should fight words that are against initiative or taking action. And I think, I really like that message because, a lot of people today tell you, you shouldn't be lazy and you shouldn't slack off. But what he's saying is not only should you be hardworking, but you should not be you should not be not hardworking. Like he's essentially saying you should fight words that are against initiative, even things, even just when a little part of you says like, oh, maybe maybe be better to maybe be better to like not do whatever you have to do today. Really, you should try to fight that word and say that and go against it. And I think that's definitely something that I'll take with me for the rest of my life. It was an interesting way of putting it, you could say, an interesting way of phrasing it that really
Mm.
resonated with me.
I like I said, I'm just so enamored by this book and what you have available for the reader to look at. Here, I think this is part of the wisdom section here. It says follow orders. And we in this country, I don't know if it's part of our DNA as America, but we have a hard time doing that, following orders, because we're always wanting to challenge. Well, who said? It's like when your parents say, do this, and you say, well, why? Because I said so. But there is that commandment that says, honor thy mother and thy father. So it's like, okay, so how do I balance all of this? Talk to us about this particular section here in the wisdom section about what what is being said here in regards to following orders.
Sure. I think what Kheti is essentially saying here is that, in life, you're going to have superiors, especially that was very true in the Egyptian economy, but it's still true today. And you're going to have superiors who are going to tell you to do things. And even if you don't think that, even if you think you could do it a better way, or you could do it in a way that even if you think you could do it a better way, you should still follow their way because they're your superior and they're the ones who are telling you what to do. And in that sense, if a boss tells you, I want you to do it this way, um, then you have to the Khedi is advising you have to follow that order because he's your boss and he has power over you.
Mhm.
So I mean, and he can fire you if he wants to. So I think it's interesting because he's giving his son very useful advice.
Mhm.
Some people might give their kids advice about a general philosophy of life that feels like you can put it less into practice and it's more just for thinking. But he's giving his son very useful advice for how to live, for how to be successful, essentially. So it's very much it almost it almost reads like a self-help book in some parts of the wisdom section.
Well, you have another one here in the wisdom section about mind your manners.
Yeah,
And what one of the things that came up when I read that the first time and I read through that was are you familiar with the concept of chivalry?
I am. Yes.
Okay. Now, I was raised more by example. For example, to without sounding sexist here, open the door for a woman, be it your wife, your sister, what have you. And I have always done that. And my wife's sister once said to me after I opened the door and I let my wife get in the car and then I closed the door, she said, "Oh, your parents raised you right." And I thought, okay, I guess it's just the way I've always done it. Are there those kinds of characteristics within ancient Egypt where there is a certain level? I mean, you've used the word superior, but I don't think it means what many people are thinking it means in our, in terms of our modern day, as opposed to in during the ancient Egyptian days. For example, you use the example of, walk behind those who are superior. I have a feeling that that word back then is more referring to someone who has greater experience, life experiences that have taught them, and you can learn from them. So you need to, walk behind them and glean what you can from them, as opposed to they are superior to you because you are inferior. Am I correct in my understanding of that?
Yes, I also think that superiors would often be, the Kheti's son Pepi is just a young scribal student, whereas a superior might be, a scribe with an official position. He might be the vizier, which is the second in command to the Egyptian king, or he might be a nobleman, and those all those people will be considered superiors. Yeah.
I'm interested in following up on this, and we'll do that as we continue here on Tell Me Your. I want to ask you about the the process of putting this book together in the format that you have it set up. Um, you have it in sort of three sections, but you've got the different tasks. I saw launderer, you know, and so forth. And of course the wall builder, and what else did I see here? The let's see, the tenant farmer. I think that's right. Yeah, the tenant farmer. A lot of these things still exist today. There are people who do all of these different tasks, and I do understand the descriptions that are given to try to assuade the son from going down one of these roads and becoming a scribe, which is, what he's really encouraging him to do. And yet, I have observed that of all of the jobs, of all of the tasks that we have on the planet, on this earth, there is always somebody who wants to do them. You know what I'm saying? In other words, there are people who they don't have a problem being, we'll call them a garbage man or a sanitation engineer, as the euphemism is, as well as a farmer, as well as working for water treatment, and so on. And the list goes on of the, I don't know if you've ever seen the program Dirty Jobs, where this one guy, he would go around the country taking on the dirtiest of the dirty jobs, where you had to go down into the sewers of New York and, that kind of thing, or clean out septic tanks, and the list goes on. But there's always somebody who, I'm going to put it this way, who actually enjoys doing that. They have the aptitude and the capacity to take that on. I mean,
Sure,
I've
yes,
worked,
absolutely.
yeah. Talk to us a little bit about that in terms of ancient Egypt.
Well, I mean, of course, I think there were always people who had to do these jobs because most of the people at that time could not read and write. And so if you couldn't read and write, you couldn't be a scribe, and therefore you had to choose one of the remaining jobs. Because if you didn't work, you starved. It was as simple as that. There were no food stamps or anything like that. Um, but I think Kheti, the Pepi's father, certainly acknowledges the fact that someone has to do those jobs, but he doesn't want it to be his son because he thinks that his son, I think he cares less about what his son likes and more about what job is going to earn Kheti the most social standing and also the most money
Mm.
and give his son a better life. And so he's essentially taking that choice away from his son and saying that, with all my experience, I know that the scribe is going to be the best job because even if you want to be a tenant farmer right now, that's not going to be a good job, the choice for you down the line because you're not going to have any money. I think that's essentially what he's saying. And life as a tenant farmer and other jobs is often quite brutal. You'd rent out a piece of land, and if you didn't pay the allotted amount to your landowner, then you get physically punished. So he's trying to persuade his son away from those jobs, and by warning him of all the dangers that are involved with those jobs.
Mm. I also noticed there's the leather worker, the sandal maker, the fisherman. I mean, the list goes on. And one of the other aspects, I think, of Egyptian life is the fact that they had a great river, an historic river, if you will, with great history, that they occupied the land along it in that regard, and they also utilized that to for their agriculture. Whereas a lot of people, again, they make the assumption that Egypt is just a desert. It might as well be the Sahara. And that's another one of those misnomers that you kind of went into earlier.
Yes, yeah, no, it's true. It's just, I mean, the landscape is totally different from what people might expect. And a lot of the time, people are exploring Egypt, they might take a river cruise down the Nile. And so all of what you see is just the Nile River. You literally don't see any desert whatsoever.
Mm. We're talking with Michael Hoffen. He is the author of, the co-author, I should say, of Be a Scribe. And this, even though it isn't the day thereof, we had National Read a Book Day going back to September the 6th. And it's basically an opportunity and an encouragement, I should say, more than an opportunity to say, hey, go out, go read a book. I mean, as a kid growing up, I remember the phrase, go to the library, read a book, and broaden your horizons. I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but I will tell you that if we pick up a copy of Be a Scribe, it's going to broaden our horizons in a lot of different ways that we probably never even thought of. What can you tell us about what you found out about, and I'm going to use the word once again, as I've already defined for you. And what can you tell us about the philosophy of ancient Egypt, what they believed, how they worshipped, and their spiritual life back then? I know that the book does not necessarily go into that, although I would put the wisdom section in that category. But can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. So, you mean the wisdom section, right?
Yeah, well, I think that the wisdom section kind of alludes to the philosophical underpinnings of ancient Egypt.
Ah, yes. Okay. So essentially, I mean, of course, there was no one person who wrote out, this is an ancient Egyptian who wrote out, this is my philosophical treatise. But um, I do think that, you can see a lot of the, you can get a sense of a lot of the Egyptian philosophy, um, by by reading the text. You can see that a lot of what they focus on is, physical material things. Of course, I'm just taking conjecture here. I don't know what they really might have focused
Hmm.
on, but a lot
Hmm.
of they have a lot of concern for the physical world, and you can see this. And they're quite scared of leaving it, and you can see this in their notion of the afterlife. Most of the objects that are found that are in museums today around the world, um, in Egyptology departments, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the British Museum, any museum really. Most of them come from tombs, um, and tombs and pyramids that were buried into the ground, and they were designed so that the person in the tomb would have a chance at an everlasting life, and an everlasting life, with all this material prosperity. And so that's why they put all those objects in the tomb, so that he would have everything that the person needed. That person would have everything that he needed to live a full life. They'd have spoons, they'd have food. They put fresh food, bread in there, inside the pyramids, to so that so that he would have enough to eat. And so it all points to this obsession with um, material life. And of course, that's not to say they didn't care about the spiritual aspect of things, but I think they had this great fear of losing the physical life. And I
Mm,
think that's one of the things that I found quite interesting as I wrote the book.
wow. Well, I know that a lot of people today feel the
No,
same
it's
way.
true. Yes.
Not much has changed in spite of 4,000 years going by. By the way, the book, the Be a Scribe, is also placed very interestingly at the Met, the British Museum, and National Gallery, Victoria, Melbourne, Australia, as well as you can't keep the book in, they can't keep the book in stock in many of these places. So you're going to want to pick up a copy. This is for all ages. And of course, with the holidays just around the corner, you're going to want to get a copy of it. No, this is not an infomercial. We're here talking to our very special guest, Michael Hoffen, about this wonderful book, which I think is a great educational tool. I'm curious as to your experience, and have you had the opportunity? Though again, I know that you're 17. I'm guessing still in high school,
Yes.
but have you had an opportunity to share in front of people, maybe in a classroom setting or a lecture hall, about the things that you have learned, the things that you have gleaned from the ancient hieroglyphics, as well as sharing it through Be a Scribe? I'm curious about your experiences in that regard.
Sure. So aside from, this interview and a number of other interviews, I the only other public experience I had was with this book with an organization called Speakeasy, House of Speakeasy, and they had a bookmobile. And their bookmobile is essentially it's a truck, but then it has many different inside there's this whole library of books. And so we went to Hudson Yards, and there were a number of children from nearby kindergartens and nearby schools. And essentially, they asked me a few questions in the public space, and we gave out free copies of the book. And it was an absolutely wonderful experience. And afterwards, the little kids got to ask me various questions about the book, and if a few parents with their kids came by and asked me about the writing process. So it was a wonderful experience. But aside from that, I haven't had many public facing opportunities.
Hmm. I don't feel so bad now. You and your collaborators took 3.5 years translating these hieroglyphs to modern day prose and gathered all of these wonderful images that these different museums and so forth allowed you to use in the book, which I think is fantastic. I faced a challenge just in my book and just in terms of quotes, and I found out no, you can't use that quote in your book unless you get permission. And I'm going, really? Okay, I don't want to get sued. That that must have been. I would take it that the various locations, the various places where you borrowed these different images, especially, were maybe rather excited about the prospect of having these images in this particular volume.
Yes, no. Um, I think that when I saw the kids' faces, I think they're kindergartens. I think what they're most excited about is the images, and then I think, and then they gradually get interested more in the text. And I actually have a parallel experience. When I was young, I used to read this book called The Osborne Encyclopedia of World History, and it was an absolutely fascinating book. This is actually what sparked my interest in Egypt, in history, and in Egypt. And so they used to have, little text boxes, and then right next to them, they would have cutaway diagrams of, let's say a pyramid in Egypt or a Roman villa. And first when I was really young, I used to just look at the pictures and I was fascinated by them. But then as I got older, um, the interest in the pictures, sparked. I started reading. I started reading the actual words beside them when I was, 5 or 6 years old, and I think, and it's the combination of those two that I think really sparks an interest in Egypt. So it sort of feels like this book is, in a sense, a rite of passage for me. I grew up with a similar book, the Osborne Encyclopedia of World History, and now I'm making a similar book for younger kids today.
Mm. Well, I think it's a great encouragement for them as well, to quote you from earlier, to be gumptious, which is
Yeah.
also one of the which is also one of the sections in the wisdom section of the book. And then, of course, uh, fate. I like this one and maybe we'll wrap up on this one. Fate is your freedom. Talk to us about what that means.
So in the Egyptian sense, it's interesting. Which section did that come from, by the way?
It's in the wisdom section.
Is it in the? Is it um? What's the just so I can get
Actually, the title is, of course, Fate is your friend.
fate
Uh,
is, fate is your friend. Okay.
Fate is your friend. Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, There was in that in that section, Kheti is describing an obscure Egyptian belief that essentially, before people would die, they'd have their hearts they have their hearts weighed, but and they had no control over whether their heart was light, which essentially meant that they were a good person. They haven't been weighed. Their heart has been weighed down by bad actions, by immoral actions, or whether their heart was heavy, and therefore, the goddess Mat, which is essentially justice, would weigh a person's heart against a feather to judge if they could go into the afterlife or not. And so as a side note, a lot of people would wear when people were being mummified, they might wear something. They might place a certain amulet so that their heart might be light, a protective spell. But so essentially, there's this belief that he's referencing an obscure belief that a scribe actually did have the ability to control the weight of his heart, and therefore could control whether he went into the afterlife or not, and therefore his fate was in his own hands, and his fate was his friend. And I think one of his big reasons for being a scribe is that scribes have the most independence, and I think this is perfectly illustrated by the fact that when he mentions the job of the fisherman, right? But most people think of fishermen as a pretty independent job. You're out on your own on the boat fishing, but he's saying when you're out on the boat, you have to share your wages with the crocodile. Your wages are the fish, but your crocodile is eating half. The crocodile is eating half of them, and if the crocodile wants to eat all the fish, then that's up to his control and not up to you. And so he's saying even the fisherman, who most people think of as bossless, actually has a boss, and only the scribe, has his own will and his own free will and gets to do what he wants. So it's quite so, and in that sense, fate is your friend. You can, your where you go is up to you. So it's an interesting thing to think about.
Well, it's tied right in with, of course, what we talk about here on the program about choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. And in a manner of speaking, our fate, at least I think that our fate is tied to the choices that we make and what it is that we want in our lives. And that if we really want that in our lives, whatever that is, then we have to choose that and then live our lives accordingly so as to achieve that, but also but at the same time, by utilizing, from Be a Scribe, from the wisdom section, many of these, I'll call them many of these tenets of wisdom that you have in the book. The story itself, am I understanding correctly that you actually translated this story, or did you create the story?
No, I did not create the story. It's a real Egyptian story.
Okay.
It was written about 3,500 years ago, and I translated it into English.
And in the process, now, where was this story discovered? I mean, we hear all the time about these different scrolls for example, the Old and New Testament being discovered in some cave and a piece of pottery and so forth. Do you know where this particular story and its actual physical existence came from?
Well, so the biggest copy of the story we have is Papyrus Salier, which we don't actually know where that copy came from, but it was bought by by a French person who was interested in Egyptology in the 1800s, Salier, and now it's now in the British Museum. But we don't know the exact location because it was sort of bought in an offhand way, so we're not exactly sure where that might have come from. But there are a number of ostraca, which are essentially pieces of pottery on which a scribal student might have written that story. When scribal students were learning to write, they copy down portions of stories, portions of texts, and this is a popular one because it glorifies the scribe's job. So so there are a number of ostraca from all over the world, from all over Egypt, Upper and Lower Egypt, that feature copies of this story.
Michael Hoffer's my guest. He is the co-author, I should say, of Be a Scribe, and I think it would be worth your while, folks, to get a copy for yourself, for your kids. If you don't have kids, maybe for your library. Be a Scribe, co-authored by Dr. Christian Casey and Dr. Jen Thum. And we certainly encourage you to go to the website, beascribe.com, which we will be linked to, Michael. We will link to it with our podcast and videocast so people can find out more about how it is working for a better life in ancient Egypt. There's a timeline in there as well that you folks can take a look at to see what time period we're talking about. And to me, it's fascinating. And again, it continues to remind me of what we started out the program by saying that nothing comes about from a vacuum. Nothing. Everything is built upon the past. Everything is built upon the past. All of the stories that we have, and it's borne out in many of the ancient wisdom teachings and historical writings that we have found. That many cultures have had similar stories, and they've been changed and so forth, and used by other civilizations down through history. So, I think that, and it seems to me, Michael, that your book, which certainly I'm sure available, even if it is available in Kindle, I know the pictures are available, but I know that it's not as it's not going to have quite the impact if it were Audible, although that would be an interesting project.
Yes, it would be interesting. I wouldn't be sure as to which order some of the insights come in, because a lot of the time you can just read it. It's not You can just read it in whatever order you like, and so it'd be hard to determine that. But I do think that part of the draw of the book is definitely the images, and I think it'd be unfortunate if someone just
Well,
wanted.
Michael, I want to thank you so much for being with us here on the program. This has been wonderful. I've really enjoyed talking with you and learning more about the work that you do, but also learning more about ancient Egypt. And it seems to me, in spite of the fact that no matter how much time goes by, the human condition does not seem to really change that much. And that has its pros and its cons. We'll have to save another program for that conversation, but nonetheless, it's been a real pleasure to have you on the program, and I thank you so much for the time.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
I have three final questions that I ask all of my guests that I'll ask you real quickly here. But first, I want to thank you for listening to and watching. Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World, where we're giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. We are here on Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m., Wednesdays at 9 a.m. That's our special edition of Tell Me Your Story. And we're also here Monday through Friday from 8 to 9 a.m. And then we stream live at those times at richarddugan.com. Our podcasts are on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, Blueberry, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and many other locations across the internet. We're on YouTube, where you can watch these conversations, and I hope that you will. And subscribe and click notifications so that when I put up a new conversation, you will be notified. We also ask you to go to Amazon.com and pick up a copy of my first, Choices. 5 Steps for Life. It's available in the three formats of a hardcover, paperback, and Kindle. I hope that you will get yourself a copy and utilize it to understand and take some of the things that we've talked about in this program as choices. And again, make your dreams come true by putting those choices into action. We also ask that during this decade of perfect vision, you spend some time going within, listening to that still small voice. I will elaborate on a future program, but we hope that you will do that. With all that being said, we ask our very special guest here on the program the three final questions that we ask all of our guests. And the first of those is, who is Michael Hoffen?
I am Michael Hoffen, and I'm an author of Be a Scribe, and I'm a lover of ancient Egypt and ancient history, and I'd love to, and I'll probably write a similar book like Be a Scribe in the future.
Mm. What is it that gets you up in the morning?
I would say, I mean, probably the biggest thing right now is probably school. But I would say I'm also motivated by a real love for for ancient history and for for the past in general. It's just something about understanding people's lives in the past specifically is
Mm.
was what always makes me fascinated. I sometimes I just wish I could get in a time machine and go back, but since we can't do that, I feel like writing a book or translating a text is the next best thing
Mm. And finally, what was your best day?
in my life. Maybe my best day was the day that the physical copy of my book came, because it's something. It's when you see it online in an online file. I mean, it looks cool, but it's a little bit. I don't. It doesn't feel quite real. But when you see it as a physical copy, it feels. I mean, it's just it's another. It's an entirely different world.
Well, Michael, thank you again for giving us so much time here on the program. We look forward to more works by you. And like I said, I love the format. It's easy to read, especially for me. And I appreciate it. And again, thank you so much for being on Tell Me Your Story.
Thank you. It was great. It was amazing to be here.
And I thank you folks for listening to and watching Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. Until our next podcast, videocast, love to lol. Jeanette, I am still listening. Dad, continue to be happy because I am. To my dear friend Smokey, hey, I'll see you on the other side. And to my friend Zorro, aho, aho.